not the light at the end of the tunnel, the reverse of that. Find a jewel in the toad's head. Because often there are things that are really, really look bad inside, but when you have a good little look, there's a little jewel in that toad's head somewhere. About listening to the river is, if you ever go down by the river and you close your eyes, you see it, you can hear the river. You can hear if it's going slow, you can hear if it's going fast, you can hear if there's anything in it, you can hear if there's anybody on it. And this sort of listening, and you know, and I always talk about there's two types of listening. There's listening to respond, which most of us do. Somebody starts to talk and halfway through you decide what the answer is. And there's listening to hear, which very few people do. And that's what listening to the river is all about. Then there's the thing about the will and the rhythm. The will and rhythm was then code for momentum, which is if you in an organisation get this will that people want to do well and they want to work together and they've got a real sense of purpose of what they're doing, then that creates a rhythm. And that will and the rhythm turns into momentum, and momentum is the most important thing you can have in an organisation because that's what delivers success. And then my favourite chapter was avoid the funeral of the living dead. And basically that means you have two choices in life. You can really have, you know, try and make it the best you can and have the best you can out of it, or you every day can be really bad. You know, that's how you avoid the funeral of the living dead. The reason I put these things up, when I started, when COVID came, on day one, and we all have to start thinking about what we do. Every single one of these things happened. Every single one of them. There was no, we started to think at the end of the line, we have to find the jewel in the toad's head, we have to listen to what the hell was going on, we have to change the rhythm of the organisations, otherwise we would have died. And that's in every single business I can think about. So, you know, everybody thinks these things are really new and it's all innovative, and actually these have been going back like about 105 years. So, you know, there's a lot to be learned from the past if you really think about it. What this has changed, and what I call these CEO skills, is having seen my CEOs operate this, and I've got 10, literally their lives and our businesses changed overnight, either for the good or the bad. And there was a bit of luck in all of this. You know, sometimes you have to be lucky to be in the right sector, and sometimes you're lucky to be in the wrong sector. It didn't really matter. You had to change. This thing here, which everybody thinks is a really funky, you know, like, oh God, you know, it's a really sick, like, slow, easy piece. Mindfulness, isn't that something you do in yoga and everything else? That became the centre of what everybody did. Because mindfulness is about living in the present. And most CEOs, most boards actually don't live in the present very much. They're always looking ahead. And then suddenly, you have to look in the present. Like, what am I going to do today to survive, or what am I going to do today to grow? So mindfulness, for me, has become one of the real skills that when I look at my CEOs and when I look at other executives, I'm really looking for them to have, because you need to have that in the current environment. And off the spin of this came all these other skills, which you'd never really associate with CEOs or with boards, which are to do with empathy, kindness, vulnerability, and compassion. Because COVID brought all those things into play. Because suddenly you're completely dislocated from all of your people and completely dislocated from a lot of your customers. And therefore you had to think about things in a much different way. And interesting, in my mix of execs, they're probably 50-50, male, female, probably my CEOs are 50-50. My women CEOs tell me this is why women CEOs should really be to the fore today, and why we should have more women executives than we do today, because women are much better at empathy, kindness, compassion, and particularly vulnerability than men are. And this vulnerability is a really important thing, because if you felt that you weren't vulnerable, you were in trouble, frankly. If you knew you were vulnerable, you weren't in trouble. So the skill base that COVID has brought and post-COVID requires in a business has actually shifted things quite a lot from where they were before. I mean, for me, this is a long-term change. And then there are all these, like, you know, you've got E-numbers, I have this thing about E-nurtures. But therefore, a lot of other skills come into play in the mix of how we're trying to think about our businesses and how we're trying to drive business forward. So empathy you've got there. There's a lot more emotion in business and with customers than before. There's a lot more expression than there was before in the mix. The strive for equality. What COVID showed above everything else is a massive gap in inequality. and therefore that is something that business has to own, and probably can impact more than governments can in reality. So the move from inequality to equality is a really important thing for businesses to think about, to be able to nurture in their world, as engagement changed completely. Because you used to be able to walk in the office or walk in the shop or walk in the restaurant, whatever it is, and you'd see the people, you'd be able to talk to them. You suddenly couldn't do that anymore. So the way we've engaged with people has completely changed, some for the good, some for the bad. For the first time, actually, one of the benefits of Zoom has been that CEOs have actually been able to talk to all of their people in the thousands at the same time, which they never really did before. And that's become very important in this sort of COVID and post sort of COVID world. So, and then this energy thing has never been, how do you create energy in an organisation where 90% of people are working from home? Because you need that energy in the mix. So my point of all this is, there's a lot of stuff changed. And if anybody thinks it hasn't, it's all going to go back to normal, it hasn't. And actually, largely a lot of this stuff I think is really for the good. And it's made it really interesting going through it, because suddenly, when you think you know most of what's happened, suddenly you realise you don't know anything. And you've got to learn a whole host of new skills. This, for me, and this is how my people describe it actually, is that now you have to listen, and you have to listen to hear, not to listen to respond. That is a big difference. Let's train that in people. And you have to listen with feeling, but now you have to lead with compassion. If you do not lead with compassion, then you are not going to be a successful leader. And then you flip back to all those skills you need to be with compassion, vulnerability, kindness, empathy. It's a bit of a shift for everybody. And actually, bizarrely, you could have been really good pre-COVID and suddenly pretty average in the midst and post it. So, what a shame. Now, I heard some of this earlier on. These are my five things that I talk to my people about all the time that are not going to change. The first one is there is a systematic supply chain dislocation. All this stuff about petrol and lorry drivers and ships is not a random thing that's just appeared and is suddenly going to get fixed. It is probably 2 years before it works its way through the system. That's how serious this is. It's a real dislocation, it's systemic. There aren't any more ships, there aren't any more containers, there aren't any more drivers, or all of this thing, and it's not happening. So, to give you an example, average container, one of my businesses ships apparel from China to the UK, average container a year ago, $1,500. Today, $17,500. So this is systemic. The ships just go when they want. If you miss the ship, you miss the ship. All businesses are run on supply chain. You never realise it until the supply chain doesn't work. Then you realise you've got a problem. And so this is the biggest risk in any organisation I know is this. And it's a big wake-up call. We've got to think about how we transport products. We've got to think about how those supply chains sing. So big deal. And don't believe all this, it'll all be all right in the morning, because it won't be. Hybrid working. That's here now. This debate about when I go to the office, when I go to the office. We used to go to, all of us, when we went to work, we went to a place. That's where we went. It was a place we went to work. It's no longer a place we go to work. It's something we do. And we can do it in many locations. And for me, I think that's probably a good thing, because it de-stresses the organisation. People commute 2 hours in the morning, 2 hours at night, do their job 5 days a week. It's pretty horrific. You don't need to do that anymore. And those smart companies realise that actually, if I'm based in Leicester, I don't need to have people in Leicester working on. I can now go and recruit in Brighton or in Glasgow or in Edinburgh or somewhere else, because they don't physically need. So suddenly my access to talent is much greater than it was before. It's not a bad thing, it's a really good thing, but your structures in your business got to be much more agile. Agility becomes a critical thing in the mix. There has been a renewed relationship with nature. I chair what's called Canal River Trust, the Old British Waterways, look after all the canals, the rivers, the reservoirs. We have 9 million people a week roughly go down to by the canals and the rivers and all the other species. That number's been through COVID about 11.5 million people. And because you go down by the river and or you're down by the canal, you walk along there and the water's there, there's some boats there, some fishermen there, there's some cyclists there, there's nature there. Everybody knows that you de-stress if you're by water, natural fact. So this relationship with nature has been renewed in a way that we don't always think about. And therefore we're much more acute about that. And then from a business perspective, the whole ESG thing was to the fore, becomes even more to the fore. Because suddenly you've got everybody in the world. It's not just how do you save the environment, how do you save the world. It's what can I do down by my local canal, by my local river, to make it look a bit nicer, because it was really nice when I was down there in the summer. So I mean, as a silly fact, this is a run of fact. So imagine we cut the grass around all those canals and rivers and reservoirs. It costs probably about 8 million a year to cut all this grass. What we've got back since this time is people saying, just don't cut all the grass though. Just cut the grass that's nearest to the towpath, because we're worried about all the wildlife that's in those other bits of grass. So if you leave that other bit of grass up, then actually the wildlife would be better for the wildlife. Never would have happened before. So this is a tangible thing. This is no longer, you know, the sort of greenwashing effect. You can't do that anymore, because now it's your people and that are saying these things to you. And actually, for me, that's a really positive thing, because the ESG then becomes the core of what the business does, as opposed to some add-on the side. And why is that really good? Because actually everybody in the organisation wants to do it, and all your customers want you to do it. So big change. Bang. Shining a light on inequality. Big time. Gap between poor and rich and everybody in between. Massive off the back of this. And you know, we should all be ashamed of it, frankly. And therefore, businesses have got to absolutely start to do something about this, not just because they need to, because they want to. And I think actually in a strange way, the hybrid working is also another way which we can help and tackle on the back of all of this. But it's easy for me to say, because I have a garden and I've got a number of bedrooms and I have an office. If I live in a 2-bedroom flat and I don't have any garden, then it's not quite the same. So, you know, big onus on us to do stuff off the back. And this is fundamental. We do not have an unemployment problem, we have an employment problem. An employment problem. And there are many sectors of the industry which are really struggling for people. Really struggling for people. And that will have a big effect. And so suddenly, retention is much more pivotal in organisation than recruitment. The most important thing is keep your people. Before you start worrying about recruitment, keep your people. I've been on this for years. All my businesses measure this first and labour turnover second. I'm really interested in how many people we kept, how many people I kept, how long they've been there. No. That's retention becomes one, because these two things, bang, are where everybody's going to get squeezed. Supply chains dislocated, shortage of people. If you haven't got people and you haven't got product, bit tricky. There's not much else left, frankly. Now, there's a thing, there's been a thing developing over a period of time about the difference between leadership and followship. And the army talk a lot about followship, for example, which is actually what they create in their leaders is the ability for people to follow them. But it's always been seen that followship, i.e. will people go with you, is the flip side to leadership, i.e. you have to be a great leader, I think that's all changed. I think actually now this is flipped, and that leadership is the flip side of followship. And therefore, again, when I think about the people I have to run the businesses, I've really got to think about, are they the types of people that you want to follow? Are they the people that you really want to follow? not are they great leaders, because the great leaders of today have to develop that one particular skill, which is the followership skill. Now, but there's a lot of stuff that hasn't changed. A lot has, a lot hasn't. These are the immutables that never change. There are only two things in business, people and products. End of story. I was told that 40 years ago by the Mars brothers. Always remember, Alan, you don't have to worry about the people, you have to worry about the product, and then you have to worry about anything else. And it's easy to get stuck around all the other things, but if you get the right people, and you get the right products, and frankly, you can't have the right product without the right people, that's all you need to know and need to have. Hence, my concern about dislocation of supply chain and not being able to recruit people. There is no business if there are not those two things. End of story. Again, a long time ago, actually 45 years ago, the Mars brothers said to me, Alan, just remember this one thing. 50% of the brains in the world are female, and brains have no colour. 50% of the brains in the world are female, and brains have no colour. Your job is to get us more brains than anybody else. It's going to take people a long time to work out that 50% of the brains in the world are female and brains have no colour, at which stage we will have more brains than anybody else. And always remember, Alan, everybody talks about head count, wrong thing, talk about brain count. When you sit in a room and you look at the people at a meeting or you're having a conversation with, count the brains, don't count the heads. And sometimes you can have 10 heads and 2 brains, and that's the wrong way around. And so the whole issue about diversity is, from a business perspective, what else do you need to know? I've seen people have all these strategies. If you're in business, you want more brains than anybody else. So here's your answer. There's your audience. Make sure your tactic doesn't change. Everybody talks about the goal scorer. Only one person scores a goal. Hundreds of people get them there. And the most important people in the business are not the people who score the goals. Actually, they're not the CEOs. They're not the executives. They're not those people. They're the people who every day are passing the bloody ball. And again, in the sort of hero, we're going to create heroes and demolishing heroes, and we've got all the social. It's actually the people who do the work, people who move the stuff around. They're the most important people. Look after them. I see kills tries when I see CEO pay, all these things going up, and then there's an argument about are the people who do the work and they get 1% or 2%? It's ridiculous, crazy. Culture, which Martin spoke about, it is fundamental, and cultures will change off the back of COVID. And let me tell you, next to people and product, because it's a mixture of the two, culture is the most significant competitive edge you have over anybody. And the reason that culture is the most significant competitive edge is you can't see it, so you can't copy it. The reason nobody can write a decent book on culture, because actually, how do you describe it? It's only you and your group, only your company. That's the way I describe it's the way we do things around here. And nobody can really see the way you do things around here. So if you create that, then everything else is copyable. Culture's not. And the way you get culture isn't saying we're going to have one, and here's the values, and can you all chant them? That's forcing it. Culture's forged, takes a long time, in many ways, and you keep it, but in a company you're trying to turn, take 10 years, not 10 minutes. And so you have to be consistent in terms of which you're handling it. But the most important thing is that you don't think that having a set of values, writing in a report, doing some employment survey, that gives you a culture. It doesn't. It's the most difficult thing to create, it's the most difficult thing to manage. And then remember what ego is. There's lots of ego around, it's edging God out. That's probably not a particularly clever thing to do. So these things don't change. All about people, it's about brains, women's brains, coloured brains, It's about the people who do the work day in, day out. It's about culture and creating one that nobody can copy, because that's your real piece of competitive edge. And it's never, ever about you. I hate in any quote or any document where people say I. It's always we. Because even if you're the chief exec, you're just a representative of the we, you're not an I. And so that's it, really. That's my whip round of what's changed, what hasn't changed, and what we all need to do about it. And it's pretty difficult to do, to be honest. But it's much better if you've got some idea what it is than if you. So I'll leave you